Last night I got a 96 in terms of my sleep score, and this, according to Samsung Health, is excellent. I want to discuss in this short video my previous sleep systems, then Brian Johnson, optimizing my sleep for high sleep scores, and the differences between Garmin and Samsung in terms of the sleep scores. Now, the difference between Garmin and Samsung in terms of the sleep score is that sometimes they align, but sometimes they don't. And in this case, I got a 62 from Garmin last night, but I got a 96 from Samsung. And the 96 is the highest sleep score I get ever. Now, before I had sleep scores of 91, sometimes 92, and on average also my sleep scores in the last weeks and months went straight up from maybe averaging 62 only years ago, and then I slowly increased basically the sleep scores, and now I'm averaging in the last 30 days, for example, I think around 80. And that's a big change. So what happened is that previously I tried sleeping 6 hours plus maybe 90 minutes during the day, plus maybe additional naps of 10 minutes, another 10 minutes. And what I did is I decided to no longer try to go to bed at midnight and then stand up at 4, or then eventually I would stand up at 6 and then sleep 2 hours during the day plus naps. But I would basically accumulate all the sleep, just like all the people recommend, and also Matthew Walker recommends, into one batch, and I would sleep with the kind of most basic sleep pattern you could think of, which would be 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. That's probably the sleep pattern that aligns with basically most of society, and also in many countries, at least where I live in Europe, there seems to be a regulation where from 10 basically to 6, there is also, it's not allowed to be that loud in your apartment, for example. Now, this was kind of the previous sleep system, and I also changed it to this. Now, I still do pay attention to trying to avoid eating at least 2 hours before bed. Sometimes I try 3 hours, but the general rule I try to stick to is 2 hours, because otherwise I just come into interference with maybe working out again a little bit in the evening or something like this. But what I noticed is that if I, for example, if I keep the 2 hours, then usually this is a better heuristic compared to trying to keep 3 hours and then maybe still being hungry, or maybe going even 4 hours without eating before bed and then maybe still being hungry, and then having to eat again within the last 2 hours before sleep, and that probably disturbs my sleep more, because if I just eat a little bit too much, then my body runs too hot and I cannot sleep, and then I'm also kind of too alert often. So just keeping the basic rule of 2 hours before sleep means I try beginning to fast at 8, or trying to stop eating at 8. Now, I want to discuss shortly Brian Johnson. Now, in the last years, I thought that maybe I just had to have low sleep scores because maybe I was trying something that many people couldn't do, and maybe I was trying something that gave me more time. And I still don't really know whether I now just have better sleep scores or whether my sleep is actually better. So there is maybe a difference, a mismatch between what would be optimal sleep for me and what Garmin as well as Samsung would just see as optimal sleep. But if both devices, for example, such as 2 nights before, I had apparently only a deep sleep of 19 minutes compared to last night where I had deep sleep of 1 hour and 10 minutes or something like this. And the difference is that on Saturday, for example, where I had this very bad sleep, where I actually went to bed at 3 a.m. in the morning, which was kind of unusual for also having tried to improve my sleep. And I also it was kind of a coincidence that I didn't drive off again into a month-long sleep pattern, or maybe even longer sleep pattern of going to bed at, I don't know, midnight, and maybe even later. Of course, this doesn't really work with a normal schedule, but I had this kind of problem before and I just couldn't really solve it. Now, Brian Johnson showed me, as well as other people, that you can have very high sleep scores, that you can have sleep scores of 95, 99. In this case, in Brian Johnson's case on Whoop, and he just made it a priority, and he tried to optimize his life towards having high sleep scores, and he actually got then a 3-month streak of, I think, 100%, with a few exceptions, and then maybe even 6 months. I don't know exactly the numbers. And what this kind of showed me is that if you take this seriously, and maybe I should also take this seriously and at least try. I mean, what would happen if I, instead of having really low sleep scores, maybe 50, maybe 60, with 6 hours of sleep, for example, I got the maximum sleep score I got from kind of both devices was maybe 65, sometimes 70, but often also maybe like 40, 45. What if I try to optimize my sleep towards what these trackers aim for, and then I would see and I could experience what this would feel like. Now, what I have to say is that the evidence, and I do have a fairly standardized training routine at this point in time. I do, for example, always 500 calories of air biking on Thursday. I do the same whole body routine on Monday, Wednesday, as well as Friday. So I also do a 1-rep max test with kind of smart gym machines before, so I kind of know what my performance is. And I also do have kind of a standardized workout, an interval workout that is trying to improve VO2 max for me. And I also do have a run that is always kind of also similar. I might change it a little bit, but because I have many things standardized and also my nutrition seems to be somewhat stable, at least I can say that, or I at least think that I can kind of differentiate the different variables. And one of these variables is sleep, for example. On Saturday I just was very bad at working out, and this was obvious, and I also had muscle ache from the day before, and this is usually not the case if I sleep well. But even though I slept like 6 and 7 hours, my body physically seemingly did not recover, and the load, basically the workout load and the stress and the strain on my muscles seemed to accumulate. Now, I have been optimizing my sleep for high sleep scores. Now, this might not be for everyone, but assuming that they know kind of what they are doing, and also assuming that Matthew Walker knows what he's talking about, and I recently listened to Why We Sleep again, and it kind of became clear that it probably was a better idea to steer towards what everybody is doing compared to what I have been trying to do, and to just maybe get high sleep scores, and then I can still maybe adopt it, but I at least know that I can, in theory at least, get these high sleep scores if I do all of these different things. But if I just never try, and then I will never find out. So I basically switched a little bit more to an experimental approach, also allowing kind of different variables, such as maybe including higher amounts of carbs again in my diet, and seeing what these do to me. But keeping basically a fairly constrained system would then allow to basically bring in and also out different variables, and then I could kind of see the impact. For example, this month I have been increasing my creatine intake from 5 grams to 10 grams, and I also did decrease curcumin or turmeric to 0 grams from basically 1 capsule a day. And having both of these at the same time now means I cannot really figure out whether it's maybe an increased or decreased sleep, or whether it's the creatine that makes me slightly stronger in the gym, or maybe also makes effort slightly less intense mentally. So I cannot really say, but what I'm trying to say with this is that if you go out of a very controlled, tight system, then you run into the problem that you don't know what caused what. Now, the difference between Garmin and Samsung is mostly, as I mentioned already, is that they often have different sleep scores. And by wearing 2 devices, I do have a redundancy. This means that when Garmin thinks I had a very good sleep, and usually it is the case that Samsung just has higher sleep scores compared to Garmin. So on average, maybe they are 10 points higher on Samsung compared to Garmin. Now, maybe it's sometimes 5 points, sometimes they have kind of a very similar sleep score, but usually it's the Garmin that is a little bit lower. I did have problems on the 6S Pro. This is the 7S Pro, the Phoenix 7S Pro. With the 6S Pro specifically, and I had problems that every now and then it would not track sleep at all. Now, I do keep them both kind of on the same wristband, which is the wristband from the Galaxy Watch, and I just got 2 wristbands of these, and it's the exact same band. So they sit also kind of identical, which means that I can compare the data a little bit better, even though the watches are a little bit different in terms of the thickness and also in terms of where they are sitting. I at least can now say that switching to the Galaxy Watch 4 band decreased basically the amounts of days where also the 7S Pro didn't record any sleep. So for multiple nights actually, when I got this watch in the beginning of this year, or actually already last year in December, it didn't record any sleep at all. So now I do know that I can get a 96 in terms of sleep scores. Now I also already, I think, got a 91 in terms of Garmin, but in terms of the Galaxy Watch and in terms of Samsung Health, this was the highest. As our last point, I want to discuss, or I want to at least kind of show what the different sleep stats in Samsung Health now would be, and this I can now take kind of as a proxy what ideal sleep for me probably looks like. Also, in terms of performance today, I didn't feel exceptional. Sometimes I do feel kind of exceptional in the morning, and I do notice that my brain is kind of in a different mental state. I can basically stay in very high modes of focus for hours in the first hours of the day, and I also can listen to basically the sound of my brain. So I usually have earplugs in, and this means if it's very quiet, then I can kind of listen to what my brain is doing. And what I think this is mostly is that I can hear the blood in my brain that is going through my brain. But there seems to be, and this evidence might still be considered anecdotal at this point in time, but to me it is kind of a sign. And the sign is that whenever I can hear basically my blood running in my brain very well, in these states I am usually in a very high cognitive state, where I, for example, could solve a math task or learn, not maybe learn something, but also read something much quicker compared to a state in which I just ate lots of carbs, for example. Now, and maybe I might be fatigued, there might be different things, but when I can hear this, then I'm usually in the state where I'm able to cognitively handle more compared to the average baseline me. Now, it would be nice, of course, if I had access to these mental states in larger portions of my time, and this is also what I previously tried with fasting, and fasting for very long periods of time, I tried going OMAD, so 1 meal a day. I also tried different patterns, and I also tried sleeping in addition, basically. So sleeping in the middle of the day would basically prolong my fast, because it would kind of reset my hunger. If I was already hungry at 11 a.m. from standing up at 4 a.m., then I would sleep 90 minutes or 2 hours. Then afterwards, I would feel less hungry, and I usually could power through the next 4 hours from 2 p.m. till 6, for example, and then I would maybe start to eat, or maybe I would work out but I would work out another hour. That's what I was trying to say. And then I would only begin eating, or start eating maybe at 8, and then eat at 9 properly, because I had to break the fast, because I was in fat burning probably already, and so my body did not really respond to food that well if I just ate all of it at once. So I also tried basically now eat breakfast and lunch and dinner, even though at slightly delayed times. And this is also mostly in order to avoid these big chunks of food in the evening that otherwise would have occurred. Now, as the last point, I want to take a look at the sleep record in Samsung Health. So this is, first of all, what it looks like. Now I have to cover my eyes, otherwise it will not focus. And you already are seeing the sleep score. I slept an amount of 7 hours, or a duration of 7 hours and 28 minutes. I additionally slept again a little bit during the day today, but not that much. But I now record also the naps with Garmin, because Garmin now has a napping feature. Samsung Health records them automatically whenever you are actually asleep. In Garmin you can also basically track sleep even though you are not, or track naps at least, even though you might not be asleep. So it allows for basically a greater variety of napping. Now, in terms of the sleep score factors, I had the total sleep time of 7 hours and 28 minutes, which means in the 8 hours I was actually asleep, or I stayed in bed, and I was exactly in bed apparently at 20, so basically at 10 p.m. And I did stand up 2 minutes or 1 minute, I think actually, before. I was already awake a little bit before, and I actually turned off the alarm because I was basically waiting in front of the alarm. And I got out of bed 1 minute before the alarm because I just happened to take a look at my watch, even though you shouldn't maybe not do this in bed, but I just was like, maybe it's already time, because I was awake, I think, multiple times during the night, which also might be the reason that I didn't feel exceptional today, but at least Samsung thinks that this is a 96 sleep score. Garmin thinks differently, but in terms of being kind of the critic, of course, or the cynic, saying that something is worse might be kind of this mental illusion that it is considered then more reliable as a source. In terms of the sleep cycles, Samsung says it's only 3 times, so some people have 4 sleep cycles usually a night. I think usually the range is from 3 to 5. Now, in terms of wakefulness, it was 4%. The physical recovery, it shows 74%, and mental recovery, it shows 79%. And all of these are basically in the blue. And in the blue is very nice because in the past, often an analysis like this would be red in terms of my sleep. Now I also want to mention a different thing, and this different thing is the following: that sleep and the lack of sleep is kind of often used as a subtle way, or not subliminal, but a subtle way to show off. It's basically, look how I seem to you today. Do I seem normal? And if so, then I can now tell you that I am this way, even with only sleeping 4 hours. So in the gym, I overheard a conversation, for example, and he first said he only slept 4 hours this last night. And then 10 seconds later, he repeated again, and he said he only slept 3.5 hours. So basically, it's a way of signaling kind of superiority to somebody else, because if I seem normal, and I did have a lack of sleep, and because it's probably kind of common knowledge that the better the sleep, the better you kind of can perform. And if I seem normal and I am basically similar compared to you right now, and I am able to have the same performance with 4 hours of sleep, then I must be kind of at a higher level in terms of the baseline. Because if I had only 8 hours of sleep, then I would be kind of superior to you in terms of my mental performance, in terms of my physical performance. And that's kind of ridiculous if one thinks about it, but I might also have used this in the past. Oh, I'm only sleeping 4 hours a night to kind of show off. And this probably might be something that's not particularly helping people to get better sleep. Now, in terms of the sleep stages, I was awake 18 minutes. I had REM sleep of 1 hour and 49 minutes, and this seems to be kind of fairly constant in terms of how much REM sleep I am getting when I sleep actually 8 hours. In terms of light sleep, it was 4 hours and 4 minutes, and in terms of deep sleep, it was 1 hour and 17 minutes, so not the 19 minutes I mentioned before. And this is what it looks like, and that's basically the end of it. In terms of sleep consistency, I had the sleep consistency the last 2 days, and it actually shows you. I don't know how much of a leeway you have, whether it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes of you then actually sleeping. Last night I apparently slept from 27 minutes after 10 p.m. and I was awake apparently 5 minutes before 6, even though I was awake I can actually remember being awake multiple times during the night. Sometimes you are awake during the night and then you just forget, but in this case not. So this was the 96 sleep score. It probably can also be translated to 96%, and it's only 4 points to 100. And if you told me a few months ago that just by doing it's not by just doing some very basic things. I basically kind of rescheduled many things of my life. I worked out in the evening before, I tried to fast. Now I eat usually breakfast as a kind of shake. And I also have kind of lunch, at least. So usually until 4 p.m., sometimes until 5, but sometimes a little bit earlier. So in between, let's say, in between normal lunchtime and in between the early to late afternoon, I usually have lunch, and then I also have dinner. And, well, This also, I think, means that I am not mentally as sharp usually, because I have just, my body constantly has to digest food during the day. Maybe it's not that much food, but this also is a factor, and I don't really know what to make of this. I mean, at least the sleep scores now show something, they show a trend, and this would actually be a good point to actually show you that my sleep scores are actually trending upwards, and not just a little bit, but very much. And this is mostly due to going to bed at 10 and trying to sleep 8 hours instead of 6 hours. So basically, I just go to bed at 10 instead of trying to go to bed at 12 now, or midnight. Now, in terms of the last 12 months, I would show you, but it is loading, and it is still loading, and it is still loading. So what should I do? So this is what the last 12 months look like. So previously I was usually below 80, and it was not that bad, as I already told you, but oh no, this is now the 8 hours, even though I'm on the sleep score, so this is the sleep time. So let's go again on the sleep score. It loaded, but then it showed the wrong thing. So now it has loaded. These are the last 30 days, and what you can see is that I often am above 85, which is considered excellent. Now, if you take these words that are also used for VO2 max, for example, then after excellent would come superior, and after superior would come elite, if you then have 1%. Now, if we take a look at the last 12 months, then it shows a sleep score of 3 minutes per day. So I don't exactly know what is wrong with Samsung Health at this point in time. Now it is showing the sleep score. The other thing was probably the snoring data. And now I do have, over the last 12 months, a sleep score. Now it switched again of 66. This was the average. Now it switched again to the snoring data, and so now it's working again. In the last 12 months, I had a sleep score of, on average, 66 points. But if we now scroll back into the other direction, ideally, then we can see that it goes down and down and down up until the point where I didn't have any sleep scores at all, because I didn't have a smartwatch, but it just goes down. Now it's 55. Now if we scroll back, it doesn't work again. So when starting to track my sleep, it actually was as low as 54 on average for the last 12 months, so basically for 12 months straight. Now, what I also have to mention is, I think that Samsung, for example, if I slept during the day, it would not account this for basically the sleep score. So only the night sleep would count. And this meant that if I slept 4 hours a night, sometimes maybe more than this, because I overslept often, because it just didn't really work out, and maybe this was also a reason why I then finally decided to try something else. But if it didn't account, basically if I slept 90 minutes during the day, and I also had REM sleep and deep sleep maybe, potentially, because my body seemed to maybe have adapted to it, because after, let's say, 2 hours of day sleep, I often would feel very, very refreshed, compared to sometimes now where I stand up in the morning and I feel like still somewhat groggy. Especially when standing up that early, I often would feel quite very well, but I often maybe also would feel otherwise. I cannot really say interpret basically my memories properly, I think. So whatever I am saying now is probably just what comes into my mind, and not so much what actually the data says. What the data says is that my sleep score went from 54, and then it basically went up and up and up again, until it now is at 66 points. And if I scroll forward, so basically if I take, for example, just the last 3 months, then my sleep score was on average 80, which is now significantly higher. But this again could also only be due to the fact that I basically took the day sleep and attached it to the night sleep, which meant that it is now tracked and also accounted for in the sleep score. So basically I don't really know whether my sleep actually improved, or just the architecture of my daily pattern now matches the algorithm better. And also Garmin, for example, does not account napping for the sleep score. Only the night sleep does count for the sleep score, which means this could just be a switch of making basically a trick on my side to make the day sleep count, and to see then what my actual sleep scores would be. What I also wanted to mention, and this is now the last point, is that I did a lot for trying to optimize my sleep, or at least my sleep scores. So I basically switched out all of my light bulbs and have now circadian lighting, which also runs on Samsung. So Samsung has smart home, and I bought bulbs that would work together with Samsung smart home, and they now basically are switching the light temperature according to the outside temperature of the sun and the outside light temperature of the sun. And I also have an automation that is manually set up by me for the light intensity, so basically how bright it is. That also is kind of emulating the outside sun, even though in winter, for example, obviously outside there is no sun at this point of the day. As I also mentioned, I switched my workouts to the morning, and this was a process that basically took now almost a year until it was finally kind of stabilized. And well, there are many other things I also tried and did, and many of whom seem to maybe not work, some of whom seem to work. Mostly it seems to come down to eating at the right times, standing up at the right times, and working out at the right times. In addition, having the proper and the light exposure at the right times. So now I try to get out maybe 20 minutes a day. This is kind of the standard recommendation, maybe 10 minutes in the morning when I drive to the gym. But sometimes when I drive to the gym, for example, the sun is not out because it's winter. And this is maybe half of the year. So then I have to make sure that I additionally get maybe in the forenoon some time sun exposure in, and then also in the late afternoon, which is very difficult in winter, because if you don't just randomly go out at 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. or then at 4 p.m. and at 4 p.m. it might already be dark. So I took a lot of trade-offs, especially in terms of the light exposure, to just get the light exposure in order to properly optimize my sleep. So as I recently read again from Andrew Huberman, in the morning it mostly seems to set kind of the bedtime if you get light exposure in the morning. In the midday, it seems to kind of increase testosterone, among other things. And the last thing I can't remember. And this is the end of the video about my 96 record high sleep score. And I think I'm approaching now kind of Brian Johnson territory in terms of the sleep score.